welcome to episode 16 of the AMT podcast. Hope you had a good week, as usual. A quiet one for me this week, as expected. Not a lot of cricket or racing on that tickled my fancy, so had to tread carefully. So, usually when it's a down week, when it's a week where I'm going to make below average, it's usually around the £500 mark. Average is about £1,000, and anything above that I consider a bonus. There's no limit to the upside as to what you can expect to make. Could be 1,500, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. You just got to ride out. When it comes to good weeks, you just want to ride out your win as long as possible. But when it's a down week, you just want to be very selective as to when you trade. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I didn't really touch the racing. Woke up for the Australian racing on Saturday, and I missed the afternoon racing. I wasn't around. I was playing golf, actually. So done a bit of work on Friday, and there's a series going on between Bangladesh and New Zealand in the one-day games. So Bangladesh have been stunned twice, which is pretty crazy. They traded as low as 1.02 in both games and got gubbed. So I got involved in the first game. Didn't do anything today being Sunday. So this is going up the same day I'm recording. So I made some good money off that. And yeah, didn't really do anything today. Had a little punt on the golf, actually. Made some, just some small stakes. Made about 100 quid off Callum Shinkwin winning the Welsh Open. Callum, by the way, is from my home club, and I'm really trying to get him on the podcast. So, I've been DMing people left, right, and center via Twitter, and no one really gets back to me. So that kind of sucks. So I think I'm going to have to get on Instagram and get on people's cases, because it's so much easier to do podcasts when you got guests on the show and you're talking to them. You don't have to script anything like I do for something like this, where I've got to go through bullet points and go through talking points. You can just let a conversation flow. So that's the next stage for this podcast. That's where I want to take it, get guests on there, have some cool conversations with cool guests. But yeah, that's something that's still in the works for now. But in today's episode, I want to talk about whether or not you need to be data-driven to be a successful sports bettor. Because there's a common misconception when it comes to sports betting, and I've realized this over the past several years when I tell people what it is that I do for a living, and they assume I must be some statistical genius with every stat at my disposal and have 3 or 4 screens and blah, blah, whatever. Now, of course, there's a standard. There's a level of understanding required when it comes to stats, probability, and data. But if you want to make it as a long-term profitable sports bettor, you must understand betting strategy and principles and ultimately have the discipline to execute. So, for sake of simplicity, I think the best way to talk about this is to categorize the 2 main approaches to sports betting, and that's hot trading and cold trading. I'm going to throw in the people who are purely data-driven in the same camp as the hot traders, and cold traders, I'm going to put them in a category of their own. So, yeah, that's how I'm going to go about it going forward when discussing this. So, hot trading is the art of, forming an opinion, whether that be through reading previews, listening to analysis and commentary from pundits, coaches, experts, studying and breaking down historical form and so forth, and forming an opinion based on that. So, for example, if we're talking about horse racing, a hot trader that operates in play would look through the horse's previous form, where it finishes, whether it likes to front run or whether it likes to start at the back. What's the jockey's opinion? What's the trainer's opinion? Who the jockeys are, the length and the going of the track, and so on and so forth. Or someone who operates in cricket would look at the state of the pitch, the par score, how well this batsman does against left arm spin. What's his batting average? What's his strike rate? Are there any injuries? What's the weather like? Are there any injuries in the team? So on and so forth. Whereas a cold trader simply looks at the prices being offered at the market and sees whether or not anything is out of whack, and from there forms an entry and potential exit plan based on how they think the event will play out over a given time frame. Now, when it comes to data, this is where a cold trader and a hot trader differ to the greatest degree. So, as mentioned earlier, a hot trader is looking to gain an edge through gathering as much information through opinions and through data, whereas a cold trader, however, only needs the basic level of understanding of the sport in order to make a profit. Now, one thing I want to outline before I delve a little bit deep into the ins and outs and the pros and cons of both, I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm just trying to offer an objective look at the facts, and I'll try and present them as fairly as possible. I'm trying to give an honest look to the two approaches, and maybe my personal bias might come in the way to some extent because my style leans heavily one way as opposed to the other. So I may be able to give more insight to one of these approaches, but you can take my opinion with a pinch of salt, because at the end of the day, whatever works for you, whether that's hot trading or cold trading or being purely data driven. But I'm someone who specializes in cold trading, and I'm of the opinion that it's more suited for most people. But hopefully this gives you guys a more in-depth look at what you can, expect to get yourself in for if you do take a hot trading approach. Okay, so now we've divided the camps, cold trading and the hot traders and the purely data-driven guys. What should you do? Well, when it comes to hot trading or gathering data, first off, the most obvious challenge in that is that it's far more time consuming. It's not easy, and it takes an awful lot of time, patience, and experience to an extent, since you'll have to deal with so much noise in the market. You have to be able to cut through the BS and decipher what information is of value and what's not. And this can be extremely difficult when it comes to listening to commentary, for example, since commentators whose jobs are supposed to be objective have sometimes ridiculously obvious bias, since pundits are often ex-players themselves. So when it comes to talking about their own team, for example, it's almost impossible to find anyone completely objective. So you have to be careful with the information you hear from them. Let's look at the Sky Sports panel, for example. And I'm going to single them out. One, because they're arguably the biggest sports broadcasters in the UK. And two, they're good for illustrating my point, since they have the most ridiculously biased panel. So on football, for example, the two main pundits, Gary Neville and Jamie Carragher, played for Man United and Liverpool respectively. And they don't even hide their bias. If you ask the respective players to name their all-time starting 11, you can bet Neville's going to lean heavily towards United and Carragher's going to lean towards Liverpool. So if you ask both players who are the top three English midfielders of the last generation, you can bet Neville's going to pick Scholes and Lampard ahead of Gerrard, and Carragher's going to pick Gerrard and Lampard ahead of Scholes. Or even Graham Souness, I remember when Liverpool nearly won the league when they had Suarez, Sturridge, Coutinho and so on. This was right before selling Suarez, and when we replaced him with Balotelli, Fabio Borini and Ricky Lambert and the likes, he said this squad is a real chance of beating Real Madrid at the Bernabeu away against the likes of Modric, Bale, Ronaldo and Benzema. So just outrageous, some of the things that commentators who are supposed to be unbiased can come out with. Or if you take their boxing panel, for example, as big as Sky are, they have arguably one of the worst commentary lineups I've ever seen. I mean, they're so hopelessly biased, and you know what? I'd actually give them a pass if their commentary was half decent, but it's so often so bad. At least Neville and Carragher are very good pundits for football. They're excellent. They're great at articulating their thoughts and giving their takes. But the boxing panel, on the other hand, they nearly always have a huge, shameless bias towards their home fighters, even if they're fighting out their depth. And this particularly for the case for matchroom fighters, in fact, since they all fight on Sky. I mean, you'd think that ex-fighters like Tony Bellew or Carl Froch and Johnny Nelson would actually be capable of breaking down a fight, correctly and objectively. And at least Froch and Bellew can do that to a good extent. They're both good at articulating a fighter's strengths and weaknesses. But suddenly it all goes out the window when it comes to their good mates fighting. And Froch just can't help but throw shade at guys he doesn't like he did, against George Groves for so long, or against Amir Khan. And when it comes to Tony Bellew, I think when Derek Chisora was fighting Alexander Usyk, he lost at least 7 or 8 rounds in that fight, and Bellew had Chisora winning. So, I mean, it's just ridiculous. And Johnny Nelson, on the other hand, he's a totally different kettle of fish. Not only can he not break down a fight, he's incoherent, and he he comes out with the most outrageous things. You just have to wonder whether or not he does it for clout or if he's actually serious. I mean, he recently said that Alexander Usyk is not an all-time great, and he himself would have beat him. And for those that don't know, by the way, Usyk's an Olympic gold medalist, undisputed cruiserweight world champion, who won every single belt away from home, and then went on to outbox the heavyweight champion in Anthony Joshua in his backyard and become a two-weight world champion. And Nelson says he's barely above average and he himself would have beaten him. I mean, how far gone do you have to be to make such a claim? Is he doing it for attention, or is he genuinely that stupid when it comes to a sport that he himself campaigned in, very successfully, by the way, in his own right? No one knows, what his angle is. But I didn't mean to veer so far off the tangent, but the point I'm making is, as a hot trader, you need to be able to decipher real valuable information from hearsay or useless opinions, and sometimes this can be tricky. The numbers, however, don't lie. Men lie, women lie, numbers don't lie. So at least going through the hard data will give you an accurate portrayal of where the value lies. But the point still stands. It's very cumbersome. Now, when we talk about cold trading, it doesn't necessarily mean betting blindly or following tipsters. Rather, it's more of a numbers-based approach to betting. It's not betting on your opinion or my opinion. You're just going by what the numbers are doing, no matter who you think is going to win. So, for example, if Terence Crawford fought Errol Spence, which is in advanced talks now, by the way, that's why I'm using this as an example, for the undisputed welterweight titles, the odds would have them around even. Maybe Spence is a slight favorite, being the bigger fighter. However, let's say when the camp starts and during the build-up, Spence struggles to make weight and they agree to a 150-pound catchweight fight and they agree to wear smaller gloves. If that happened, I would expect the odds on Spence to plummet, especially the odds of a knockout, since the weight and strength advantage lie with him. Or if Chris Eubank was fighting Conor Benn, that's another fight which is in advanced talks. If they agree to a welterweight limit, the odds on Conor would shorten dramatically, since Eubank is a natural middleweight. He'll be weight drained for a fight that he'd otherwise be favourite in. Or in football, if Liverpool are playing home to Chelsea and Liverpool are around evens but Van Dijk gets injured, then their odds are going to drift and so forth. But let's take a look at the most extreme example, which I in fact take when it comes to horse racing. Now, this is a sport I've been profitable in for over 5 years, and I still know literally nothing, nor do I care about the jockey or the trainer or the length of the race or the handicap or the going of the track. The only thing I'm looking at is the numbers. So when it comes to pre-race trading, I'm looking at what range is the price trading at? Are we at the support or resistance levels? Is there enough volume on the back or the lay side to break the range? Where's the natural resistance points? Is there liquid, stable price action, or is there volatility? What time frame are we trading in, since price action behaves very differently depending on how far out from the off we are? So as a pure cold trader, I'm just looking at the numbers. Now, if we're splitting hairs, cold trading is never entirely cold, since in order to determine value, we do need to know what key bits of information influence price. So in the boxing examples that I gave, understanding things such as weight, glove size, ring size, whether it's home or away, is going to have an influence over the price, especially when it's between two world-level fighters, where it's a game of very fine margins. That's why fights fall through so often and they don't happen, or we have to wait years for them to happen in boxing, because there's so many things that have to be agreed on, and this can be very difficult. But if it's a fight between a world level fighter and he's fighting his mandatory, or just an area or regional level fighter, the A side always dominates negotiations, and things like glove size, ring size rarely influence the price much, since the better fighter nearly always wins. When it comes to horse racing, again, just a basic understanding of what influences price action is all that's required. So I can open a market, and depending on what type of race it is, I can gauge how the price action is going to play out. So if it's a handicap race, I already know that there's a fair bit of information already on the runners, and it's the job of the handicappers to weigh each horse accordingly based on form. So given that, I can reasonably expect some steady price action, which I can exploit through scalping as opposed to, say, a novice or a nursery race where there's very little information to go off. So the price action is going to be far more volatile, and I can apply some potential swing trades. I also know that for highly liquid events like grade 1 and grade 2 listed races, which often happen at major festivals, there can be up to 10 times more liquidity and even more stable price action. And because of that, I know I can get stuck in far earlier, potentially hours earlier than, say, a regular weekday handicap race where the window is much smaller to scalp. The time frame can be as short as the final 2 minutes where the liquidity is highest. Whereas on a festival, I can be trading 3-4 hours before. Or if you take another sport that I trade, like cricket, the only real things I care about is the state of the pitch and how it evolves through the course of a match. So if it's a dust bowl, then it's going to crumble and it's going to favor spin bowling. Or if it's a green top pitch with overcast, it's going to favor swing bowling. And from there, is the game home or away? What's the par score? Who's playing? What's the weather like? Those are the only key variables required to make money. All you need to know is the bits of information that are going to influence the price. Everything else, like the commentators' opinions and all these small factoids, I just ignore everything. I try and ignore as much noise as possible. I try and have the least amount of information possible that's going to influence my betting when I get involved in a market as a cold trader. So, yeah, understanding the key variables influence price action, that's all that's necessary to spot value in betting. With racing, I couldn't tell you anything about Willie Mullins' horses or Henry de Bromhead or whether AP McCoy or Frankie Dettori is a good trainer or jockey, whether this track suits that horse, and nor do I care. I just care about what the numbers are doing and within what time frame it's happening. You could spend all your time gathering all bits of information, forming an opinion accordingly, and guess what? You may have a better informed opinion of me than me. But if you don't have an appreciation for the numbers and the value, you will not make money. You can be right more often than you're wrong and still lose money if you don't account for value, if you don't account for the numbers. And conversely, you can be wrong more times than you're right and still make money if you bet where there's value. So it doesn't matter how much information you have at your disposal. If you're not accounting for the numbers and if you're not backing value, you will not make money. It's as simple as that. So what's better, hot trading or cold trading? Now, the short answer is it's impossible to be long-term profitable without accounting for the numbers. If you cannot spot value, you won't make money. And in order to spot value, only basic knowledge of the key metrics that influence price is necessary. And it's the quickest way to profitability. A data-based approach without accounting for the numbers is impossible to be long-term profitable. If you're right even 90% of the time, but are getting poor value, it just takes one loss to wipe out your gains. So there's two questions to keep in mind before taking a data-driven approach. One, is it worth my time? And in order to determine that, you have to apply a sort of cost-benefit analysis to your approach. And you need to weigh up the advantages because it's so time-consuming and difficult to gather all the necessary information and decipher what's of value and what's not. The added effort, is it worth the edge? And for most people, the answer is no. Because when you factor for time constraints like a full-time job or having bills to pay, most people won't be able to take the time needed to go through all the information and filter it. And two, you need to determine what kind of learner are you. If you have an analytical mind and have the patience to spend hours upon hours going through data, then it may work for you. Again, it's not guaranteed. However, for someone like me, who does at least have an appreciation for the data, I'm more of a feeler. I prefer to look at the numbers and spot value. The less information I know, the better. And I often find that the more information I have at my disposal, it often interferes with what I'm seeing live. And one thing you can't afford to do when it comes to trading is be indecisive. You have to commit to your position. There's nothing worse than having all these numbers at your disposal and you look at a market and you see something entirely different and you try and find a way in between both. That rarely ever works. I go by what I see on the screen or what I'm seeing live, and I try and ignore the numbers as I try and ignore the data as much as possible, because you also fall down the rabbit hole of over emphasizing past data, because past data isn't always indicative of the future. There can be many variables at play live that aren't accounted for. So cold trading has always worked best for me, and it's never failed me thus far. So look, is it a total waste of time being data driven? No, not at all. In fact, some of the most successful traders and gamblers have been from an analytical background, but the chances of making it are much smaller. Take Billy Walters, for example, who's one of the most famous mavericks in the betting world. He's made hundreds of millions of dollars through computer analysis using algorithms by inputting every bit of information he could to ultimately produce highly efficient betting lines that would often differ substantially from the bookies. So he would therefore take advantage of the discrepancies and profit big. And as soon as the bookies clocked on and banned him, he hired a syndicate that placed bets for him. I think he had one guy that would bet on the losing team for a 5-figure amount, and that would spook the bookies into shortening the odds before using another guy to hammer the odds for 6 figures on the real selection. So he often targeted basketball or football games, student level games where the bookies had weak information, and he would just hammer them. And despite his crazy success, that pales in comparison to another Las Vegas maverick called Bill Benter, who went from cleaning floors to counting cards and hammering bookies in Las Vegas to winning $1 billion on racing. That's right, billions with a B. So Bill, he was able to statistically quantify every single metric of a horse race. He went from a simple 20 variable system to hiring consultants, coders, mathematicians, and other pro gamblers in order to build a highly efficient 170 variable model that netted him unprecedented amounts of profits. And with time, he increased his staking eventually and volume of betting. And it got to a point where he was placing up to 400 bets an hour. And he went from losing $120,000 in 1 year to making $600,000 to making $3 million to $50 million, climaxing with one of the greatest bets in history, the triple trio, where he successfully predicted the first, second, and third places of horses in 3 straight races. Now, if you run the math, given the number of runners there were, the odds on that happening runs in the tens of millions, the different possibilities. Now, I've glazed over the details and the setbacks they faced with regards to the authorities and the court cases and so forth, which is to be expected when operating at that level of profitability. But the point is, yes, it's possible to gain a massive edge and net virtually unlimited profits through a data-driven approach. But like anything at the highest level, only a select few will make it. It's notoriously time-consuming and difficult, and you have to trust that you're going to find an edge that the bookies don't have. And the bookies have so much money at their disposal. They have the best statisticians compiling the odds. You have to trust that you or your team can outdo them. And another thing with being a hot trader or being data-driven is that it's very easy to get emotionally attached to your results, because you can be doing everything seemingly right according to the data or a hot trader's opinion and still lose 10, 20, 30 bets in a row. And it can be completely down to variance and just being unlucky. But because it's based on your opinion and not a numbers-based approach, you'll find it difficult to not get attached. So cold tradings are far quicker and more straightforward, at least on paper. And it's just a lot more accessible approach to the average layman. You're just following the numbers, and if the numbers are doing what they're supposed to do, you'll find opportunities all the time. You don't need to be a math genius. And this is why I recommend it. Yes, it requires absolute discipline in your approach, but given the time constraints and, as I said earlier, the asymmetric information disadvantage that 99% of people have, being purely data-driven can be fruitful for the right person, but it's rare. You have to know what you're up against, and these days bookies are so advanced and so sophisticated. It's very difficult to get an edge over them. They have the best stats teams compiling their odds, and they've got the bankroll. to fund these sort of teams. So you're really up against it. And like I said earlier, another point is that cold trading is never truly cold. You still have to understand the key pieces of information that influence price, but knowing why the numbers move and having the discipline to manage risk is all that's needed to be successful. So, that's the main reason why I teach cold trading when it comes to my cricket racing pack or my horse racing video pack. For any of my students, they will all know that all I teach is just the basic key variables that influence the price, and then having the discipline to manage your risk accordingly. And honestly, you can turn profitable within a couple of months if you have the right mindset and you have the discipline to manage your bankroll. But when it comes to going by the data or going by experts' opinions, and looking through form, you can spend so many hours and it can just take so long for you to eventually turn a profit. It's such a big gamble, and it's probably not worth your time. And I do the same thing to an extent with cryptocurrency or other investments. I'm just looking at the numbers, and if the numbers are doing what they're supposed to do, I'll make a trade. There's so much noise out there. There's so much fake information. Someone like me who doesn't have any inside knowledge, it's very difficult for me to gain an edge on the market. So I'm of the opinion that hot trading and being data driven suits people who have the patience and the discipline, and who can really, see out and play out those sort of things. You have to have an analytical mind, an analytical approach, or you have to have some sort of inside information if you're going to go down that route. But cold trading, understanding how the numbers work, understanding how betting strategies work, and having the discipline to execute is going to be far more accessible to people. You're going to really increase your chances of success by taking a cold approach. So, like I said, that's the reason why I teach it, and I've had many successful students doing it that way. But I hope I've been fair in my critique. I've tried to give the facts as objectively as possible, and I accept that my understanding of hot trading and being data driven isn't up to par as someone who might have taken that route. So you'd have to ask someone in that regard, but I can absolutely vouch for cold trading in that it's easier, right? I take that back, not easier. It's simpler, and you have a higher chance of success of making it cold trading as opposed to hot trading or gathering data. But that's just my 2 cents. Hopefully this has given you a clear and realistic breakdown of the two approaches and why you're more likely to have success with one as opposed to the other. So we'll wrap it up here. Hit the like button, share, comment, subscribe, please. It helps the channel. And also, by the way, I have an announcement, and that is that the episodes to this podcast will now be available on Spotify and Apple Music too. So you don't have to be on YouTube. You can be in the gym, commuting, going for a walk, going for a dump. You've got no excuses not to listen. And eventually, I'm really hoping to get some guests on here. Like I said, no one really responds on Twitter, so expect another announcement soon for me on Instagram, where I'll be sharing, just some lifestyle stuff and what I get up to on a day-to-day basis. And like I said, hopefully interact with people in trading or in sports circles so I can have some cool conversations with them. Anyway, all episodes will be released Monday morning going forward. So I'm going to be consistent in that regard going forward. Anyway, speak soon, guys. Peace.